Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again. Tonight, we are going to follow up with our Industrial Revolution lecture by looking at some of the effects of the shifts that took place during the Industrial Revolution. So let's begin. One of the biggest changes that came from the Industrial Revolution were the countries that moved forward developmentally. Development is a process of improvement in the material conditions of people through the diffusion of knowledge and technology. So that knowledge and technology that was associated with the Industrial Revolution moved countries forward. We saw an improvement in the material conditions of people and people's lives. And so that's what we're talking about tonight, are some of the ways that we can evaluate development and the differences between countries that we will define as more developed and less developed. And so development includes a lot of different things. It can include both economic advances, such as creating new jobs and improving incomes for people, but it can also include cultural changes, such as improving healthcare and providing schooling for everyone. And so there's two different ends of a spectrum. All right, so what I would draw down at the bottom of your notes is, a line. And on one end of that spectrum is more developed countries, a country that has progressed relatively far along this continuum of development. And so notice that word continuum. So we've got our line, our spectrum, our continuum. And then you've got countries that have progressed far along there. On the other end of that spectrum are less developed countries, or LDCs. And these are countries that are at a relatively early stage in the process of economic development. And so even though we have these two different definitions, more developed and less developed, and there's alternative names that go along with them. More developed might be developed, relatively developed. Less developed could be developing, things like that. These are two ends of a spectrum. And so all the countries of the world are going to fall somewhere on that line. It's not just two categories, more and less. It's two ends of a continuum. And different countries are at different stages. And that's important. So let's start by talking about some of the different economic activities that happen around the world. And so the sectors of activity are divided based on how closely people will work with natural resources. The left-hand column that you see there are the three major sectors of the economy. We'll start with the primary sector, the portion of the economy concerned with the direct extraction of materials from Earth's surface, generally through agriculture, though sometimes by mining, fishing, forestry. We could add oil extraction to that as well. Essentially, the primary sector is going to be extracting raw materials from the earth. The secondary sector, the portion of the economy concerned with manufacturing useful products through processing, transforming, and assembling raw materials, is all about taking those primary sector resources and turning them into more usable forms. And so the key there, manufacturing, industry, processing, that's what the secondary sector is about. The tertiary sector is the portion of the economy concerned with transportation, communication, and utilities, sometimes extended to the provision of all goods and, here's the key, services to people in exchange for payment. Tertiary sector is about services, and those services can include personal services like cutting hair, giving massages, as well as things like entertainment, transportation, and retail. Now, those are the three major categories, but sometimes the tertiary sector is subdivided based on what kind of service is being provided. So, the right-hand column shows some of the different categories of services. We start with the quaternary sector. The service sector industries concerned with the collection, processing, and manipulation of information and capital. Sometimes includes finance, administration, insurance, and legal services. Okay? The quaternary sector is the knowledge based sector that includes business consulting, financial services, education, public administration, and computer services and software development. The quinary sector is the service sector industries that require a high level of specialized knowledge or technical skill. Examples include scientific research and development and high-level management. The quinary sector consists of the highest level decision-making and the advancement of human capacities. And so this is going to include the top officials in various levels of government and business, decisions that are made by a country's president or their senior advisors or by corporate executives that can affect millions of people. We're going to talk more about services here in a couple of minutes. All right, so let's take a look at some patterns of economic activity that exist between more developed countries, MDCs, and less developed countries, LDCs. Now, let's start out with, what do you notice about the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector employment in LDCs and in MDCs? So start out with some observations. What do you notice? Then let's shift gears and compare the two in each of these sectors. So which level of development, MDC or LDC, has more employment in the primary sector? So which of those two categories, more developed or less developed, has more people working in agriculture? Then, which level of development, again, more developed or less developed, has more employment in the secondary sector, in manufacturing? Then, finally, which level of development has more employment, a higher percentage of people working in the tertiary sector? Are they MDCs or LDCs? Now, let's take a look at a couple specific examples. So hopefully you noticed on the previous slide that LDCs tend to have a higher percentage of workers employed in agriculture, in the primary sector, while MDCs have a higher percentage employed in the tertiary sector, in services. And that is because the primary and tertiary sector employment rates are good indicators of development. By that we mean there is a clear divide between MDCs and LDCs when it comes to those metrics. Take a look above. Today, in the United States and in other countries that are developed or highly developed, or MDCs, the primary sector employs only about 5% of the labor force, while in a less developed country or in developing countries like Ethiopia is seen here, it might be over 70%. Now, the secondary sector isn't typically a good indicator of development because both MDCs, or developed countries, and LDCs will manufacture goods. But MDCs tend to manufacture goods that require a very large skilled labor force, think electronics, while LDCs, or developing countries, will manufacture goods that might require a large low-wage labor pool, like textiles. Now, in developed countries, like the US, where manufacturing is on the decline, the tertiary sector is expanding and dominating the labor force, which then brings up a point that we should mention, a phrase that we should be familiar with, and that is post-industrial. And the term post-industrial is associated with countries where the service sector, the tertiary sector, dominates economic activities. They're moving beyond the manufacturing sector, and more people are working in services. And so both the United States and Canada are considered post-industrial, as well as many countries in Europe, as well as Japan. Now, we talked about the tertiary sector before. This slide is just a good summary of a lot of the different things that can be classified as the tertiary sector. And we also mentioned that sometimes the tertiary sector or the service sector is subdivided into tertiary, quaternary, and quinary. And so I want to add on a few other classifications as far as services and types of services that might be out there, just so that we're familiar with them. And so there are services that relate to things like transportation and communication services. This can include transporting things by highway, railway, airlines, pipelines, as well as with communication, telephones, radio, television, and the internet. And then there are two other broad categories of services called producer services and consumer services. They're not on this slide, so you'll have to add them to your notes. Producer services are services that cater to people who produce things, so manufacturers or companies. And so producer services might include things like insurance, legal services, banking, advertising, wholesaling, retailing, consulting, information generation, as well as real estate transactions. And an increasingly important producer service is the collection, generation, storage, retrieval, and processing of computerized information. And that can include things like research and development, publishing, consulting, as well as forecasting what the market might be doing in the future. And in much the same way that there are services that cater to companies and producers, there are also services that cater to consumers. So consumer services might be those that are provided to the general public and include things like education, government services, recreation and tourism, as well as things like health and medical care. And within that consumer service category, one of the fastest growing services is tourism. Shifting gears a little bit, now we're going to introduce a concept that allows us to classify levels of development more effectively, to draw a greater distinction between more developed and less developed. And here we're going to introduce the world systems theory created by a man whose name was Immanuel Wallerstein. All right, now later on in the year, we're going to get into a lot more detail about this, talking about dependency theory and a whole bunch of other stuff. But essentially what Wallerstein said is that there was a single world, not a first world, second world, third world, okay, which are Cold War terms. But he argued that there's a single world that is connected by and through a network of capitalism. And so we're connected through the world economy. And that's what he meant by world systems, is that we're all connected in this system. But that there is a global core and a global periphery. And in between those, a phrase that he created called the semi-periphery. Now, if you take a look at this azimuthal projection centered on the North Pole, we can see that the global core is near the center of the So let's take a look at some examples. All right. And so from the country standpoint, we've got countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Germany, Canada, Japan, Australia, South Korea. And from the regional standpoint, we could label whole regions like Anglo-America and Western Europe. Anglo-America just being the United States and Canada. Now, what I would encourage you to do with this is add some additional examples to each of these lists. And Wallerstein believed that core states were countries that were militarily strong, shared a high skilled labor force, and possessed a very diversified economy that was based on a system of production that relied on high inputs of capital per person. And so a lot of wealth per person invested into this. Now, on the other side, the periphery possessed a less skilled labor force and a more labor-intensive system of production. So you needed more workers, and they tended to be paid less, so lower capital per person. And peripheral regions tended to be colonies rather than fully fledged states, or to have a history as a colony, were relatively weak politically and usually lacked diversified economies. By that we mean they tended to focus on one sector and one sector alone and be especially dominant in that sector, but not have anything to fall back on. All right? So some examples could include countries like Guatemala, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Yemen, North Korea, Afghanistan. And then from a regional standpoint, as far as a whole region that is characterized as being part of the periphery, even if not every single country is, but just as a generalization, we would say sub-Saharan Africa. And so these are areas without a lot of diversified economy. For example, if we were to talk about countries that relied too much on, say, oil, if people stop buying oil, they don't have anything to fall back on. And so those are concerns. Now, let's talk about the semi-periphery. Semi-peripheral regions have characteristics of both the core and the periphery. For example, semi-periphery countries have some capital-intensive manufacturing, and they've also begun to diversify their economies. And they're likely to be either core states that are in decline or once peripheral regions that are now on the rise. And in the early 2000s, Goldman Sachs coined the term BRICS to refer to emerging economies where companies could invest and see high return. But all of these BRIC countries are also examples of semi-periphery countries. And so Brazil, Russia, India, China. Now, sometimes an S is added to BRIC to refer to South Africa. And we could also add other examples as well, like Argentina and Chile. These are all examples of countries that are either core countries in decline. Russia is a really good example of that. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a superpower. Now it's a bit in decline. And then also periphery countries on the rise: Brazil, India, China, South Africa, countries like that. Now again, I would encourage you, let's add some others. What might be some other examples of semi-periphery countries? And they are countries that would probably fall in the middle of our development continuum. That's what semi-periphery is. They're in the middle between core and periphery. Now the article down at the bottom asks if MINT countries are the next BRIC countries. These MINT countries are Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. So, is MINT the new BRIC? Let's see. Now, before we do anything with this, let's ask a couple questions. First, what type of map are we looking at? Type of thematic map. At what scale are we analyzing this? And then another question that I will often ask when talking about maps and different metrics of data and things like that is this a good indicator of development? In other words, what we mean by that is there a clear divide between MDCs and LDCs? So, is the world systems theory a good indicator of development? Is there a clear divide? Yes. It divides the world into three categories: core, which are the most developed, semi-periphery in the middle, and periphery, which are the least. So you remember BRIC: Brazil, Russia, India, China, all in the semi-periphery. So is MINT the new BRIC? Let's take a look. Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. So, is MINT the new BRIC? Now, what I want you to also do, Remember those examples I had you write down on the last few slides? How do they compare to this? What core countries did you add to the list? Does it match up with this map? What about your periphery examples? What about your semi-periphery? And if you didn't add examples, take a look at this map and let's add some. Or what are some observations? What are some questions? What's a country that you think, well, that's weird. I would have thought it was this. Let's have that conversation. Now, shifting gears again, we're going to talk about the Human Development Index. Now, because so many development indicators correlate with one another, a lot of development experts question whether improving one metric, like education, could lead to improving conditions in other markers of development. And this brings up a really big question that kind of pervades a lot of statistics, and that is correlation versus causation. Are two pieces of data related? We use correlated to mean that. Or does one cause the other? So improving education, does that cause improvements in development? Or is it just related to improvements in development? These are really big questions. Well, in 1990, a Pakistani economist created, and the United Nations, or the UN, adopted a metric of development that was based more on human welfare rather than exclusively looking at economics as a metric of development. And so in 1990, the Human Development Index was launched. Here's the definition. An indicator of the level of development for each country constructed by the United Nations, combining income, literacy, education, and life expectancy. This is a great indicator of development. Let's look at how countries are evaluated using this system. Please make a note in your notes what the 4 indicators of the Human Development Index are. So please write these down. Make sure that you know what they are. Here we go. There's 3 different dimensions and 4 indicators that are part of this. In the health dimension, life expectancy is the indicator. So life expectancy at birth, one of the 4 indicators of the Human Development Index. In the education dimension, we average 2 indicators together. The first is average years of schooling measured at age 25, so mean years of schooling at age 25, and expected years of schooling at the start. So what is the expectation when you begin school? How long should you go to school for? And how long do you actually go to school for, on average, by age 25? And then in the living standards dimension, it is gross national income per capita, GNI per capita. So there is still an economic indicator that's involved with this, but it's not the only indicator. So let's take a look at how countries fare. All right, so let's start by asking, what type of map are we looking at? At what scale are we analyzing this? And finally, let's ask, is the Human Development Index a good indicator of development? Remember that we mean, is there a clear divide between MDCs and LDCs? If there is a clear divide, then this is a good indicator of development. Can you see divisions between the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery? Yes, we can. This is a very good indicator of development. Now, this map comes from our textbook, so it's a little bit older, but we've been able to find the most up-to-date information, and that's what I'm going to provide you here. The most developed country on Earth, according to the Human Development Index, is Norway. Norway is number 1 on the list. Rounding out the top 3 is Switzerland at number 2 and Australia at number 3. In addition to that, in the top 20, a couple notable mentions. Singapore comes in at 9th. Canada is 12th. The United States, 13th. And Japan is 19th. In fact, 13 of the top 20 countries are in Western Europe. A good trend to note. On the other end of the spectrum, Niger is the least developed country on earth according to the Human Development Index, coming in at number 189. So there are countries that don't register on here because they lack data or things like that. But as far as countries that have data, Niger, the least developed country on earth. Central African Republic is just above it at 188th. Yemen is 178th and the least developed country on the list that isn't in Africa. In fact, 18 of the 20 lowest countries are in Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Haiti, which is on the western portion of the island of Hispaniola, is in 168th, tied with Afghanistan. And even though this map shows that there's no data for Afghanistan, that is because it's an older map and this data is more up to date. And if we were to project this system back to the 1970s, because remember it came about in 1990, if we were to project it back and to look at how countries changed over a 40-year period, of the 135 countries examined, every country improved over this 40-year period except for 3. So of the 135, all of them had higher levels of human development except for 3. And those were Zimbabwe, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zambia. But it's important to note, when 2010 came about to now, the most up-to-date information is from 2018. Zambia moved from a value of 0.395 to a 0.588 in less than a decade, 0.395 to 0.588 from 2010 to 2018. In Zimbabwe, in 2010, was dead last, and in less than a decade has passed 33 other countries. So countries can make dramatic improvements in a short period of time. Even the overall development levels have improved. Zimbabwe had the lowest value in 2010 at a 0.140. And while Niger is in dead last in 2018, their value is a 0.354, substantially higher than the last place country less than a decade ago. So there have been dramatic improvements in levels of development over time. This last slide is just a good review slide. That's all it's intended to be, is just taking a look at a variety of different characteristics and data that could be helpful for differentiating levels of development. So I want to point out a couple of things. All right. This slide includes characteristics of MDCs, which are labeled here as more economically developed country, or MEDCs. So some characteristics of those MDCs, MEDCs, as well as less economically developed countries, or LEDCs. It also includes employment structure based on the sectors of the economy. Now notice that MDCs have more tertiary sector employment, while LDCs have more primary sector employment. It also includes urban and rural divides. Notice that MDCs tend to have a larger urban population, while LDCs have a larger rural population. In addition to that, there are population pyramids, which will make more sense later, but for now, notice how MDCs have a smaller base, and that means that they have fewer young people, while LDCs have a very large base, meaning lots of young people. And then finally is the Brant line, which, when it came out in the 1980s, divided the world into the more developed north and the less developed south. So this is the same line that was used on the polar projection from a few slides ago when we were talking about Wallerstein. So if you go back and look at that slide, the line that divided the core from the periphery is this Brant line. All right? It isn't widely used anymore, but it's definitely something that you may hear about. And that's where we end for tonight. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I'll see you back in class.